All right, so I'm just recording immediately after the previous video just to wrap up the series on God, the argument that we talked about. So we started with the principle of sufficient reason. That was the core element of the argument, and I define it in this way: that if something can be different from what it is, then it requires an explanation, something to select the specific possibility other than the other possibilities. And we applied that to the existence, to a more general category of necessary beings. And in general, we said, okay, if we have something, if it can be different from what it is, it requires an explanation, a cause. And then we went down, and the only way that chain could end was to come down to something that cannot be different from what it is. And that was like the ultimate explanation, something that explains, but it doesn't require an explanation itself because it cannot be different from what it is. We also talk about an alternative one where there's actually an infinite number of these. Not infinite basically, but the chain can go up to infinite, which would mean that everything in this universe can be different from what it is. And there is no such a thing as ultimate explanation. And I talked about that alternative and try to show that it's not a very good option, because in that view it's not really infinite explanation, but basically turns into no explanation alternative. If there is absolutely nothing, no end to that sequence of asking for explanation, that the whole concept of explanation seems to fall apart. So that was our definition of God. We said, okay, God is something that cannot be different from what it is. And that was like the first part of the argument. And in the second part, we start getting into some of the God's attributes. I didn't go into all of them because I didn't want to develop like a systematic theology, but just chose a couple of them, showed a template of how to drive these different attributes. That we said, okay, I'm going to look around, look at all the entities, everything that exists, and then look if I can find some similar attribute among them that I can basically bypass the filter of being limited, being a creature, to the act of existence itself. And if we can do that, then we can actually equate God with that. The act of existence, we can equate it with that. And so based on that, we realized that, after we showed that, okay, God is the act of existence, and then after that we showed, okay, God is power, God is good, God is love, and other attributes that we talked about. So that's the general picture. Now there are a couple of interesting points regarding this whole process. Now in the last lecture I also mentioned creation, because that's also an important topic. What does it mean for God to be a creator? And we said that creation in this sense basically means the radical dependency that we have on God. And God does not depend on us, doesn't need to create, but we completely need God to exist the way that we are. And that was the process of creation. There is also a very important idea regarding God, which comes up in the argument of St. Thomas Aquinas regarding essence and existence. So that argument is not a very persuasive argument. At least I'm not persuaded. If you go into details, yes, but it just has a lot of metaphysical baggage that is not easy to absorb. My goal with this argument was to make it much easier to understand. Now, but that argument, I really love that argument because it's clear and it gets to the point. It gets it right about what God is. Now, that argument works basically in the sense that everything that exists has an essence. It is what it is. It has what it is. It has an essence. It has a nature. And it has an existence. So everything, it is something, and that something exists. So Aquinas first tries to prove that there's a real distinction between the essence of a something, of what it is, and its existence, that it is, and then argues that, okay, if we have things that they have these two real distinct elements, then for that thing to exist, there must be some cause to basically put these two things together to make that thing exist. They are basically participating in existence. They're not by themselves existence. They're participating, and therefore they require a kind of cause that makes them participate in that existence. So in the end, it says, okay, that chain cannot go up to infinity. So therefore it comes down to a point where you have something whose essence is not different from its existence, whose essence is existence. And that's what we know as God. And now that's a very, very good argument, because it shows a very important point about God. The fact that God is not in any genus. And that's a very, very crucial point regarding God. What do we mean by that? What do we mean that God is not in any genus? Because if you follow the arguments and we came to the conclusion that God is the active being, that's the way that St. Thomas goes, then God cannot be in a genus, because if the essence is existence, then the only genus that God could be in is the genus of being, but being cannot be a genus, as Aristotle explains. I won't go into details of that, how we can prove that being is not a genus. So the only genus that we have is basically substance. That's the largest genus that we can talk about. Now this is crucial. That's why I'm saying that this is a very crucial point. That God is not a substance. A substance will always have its essence different from its existence, but God is not a substance. And that's the major error that everyone makes about thinking about God. Okay, what do we mean? Let me make it more clear. So that's why I love the essence existence argument, because it makes that point extremely clear. So a substance is basically something that exists on its own. You know, we have there are lots of things that exist. Like I have like a blue box, for example, over there. Now the blue on that box is not something that we can see it in the world. The blue, you can't get somewhere and see blue, you know. Blue is always something that basically is put on something else that already exists. Like there's a box and that's blue. There's a car and that's blue. And that's what Aristotle put in the category of accidents. But that thing that exists on its own, and it's not like blue as an accident, that's what we call a substance. So substance is very general genus of a thing that exists, a thing that has existence, or in other words, an essence that participates in the act of existing, something that exists. Now, when we say that God is not in a genus, we mean that God is not a substance, and that's a very, very interesting point to think about, that God is not a substance. God is not something that exists. And that's the crucial error that everyone makes. Because when we think about God, we say, okay, but in the end, God must be something that exists. But no, you know, because when you say God is something that exists, basically you're saying that God is this thing, is this essence that now exists. But that would put God in a genus of substance. But that's false. And we can see that in the essence existence argument from Aquinas, because if God were actually an essence, something that has existence, then it itself requires a cause. It wouldn't be the first one. Because why? There is a possibility for this essence to exist. Because if we don't say that the essence and existence are the same, if we say that there is a distinction between them, as there is a distinction in substance, then okay, then what puts them together? There's this possibility they're distinct. They're really distinct from each other. So what puts them together? There's a possibility for them to be distinct, to be separated. So that really shows, and that's a very interesting thing to think about, that God is not a substance. And that's a problem that many have when they think about God, that they think that God is something like a being, an entity somewhere, something exists. But now it's a very kind of high-end luxury kind of being. Is something that is immaterial and is a very perfect kind of being. But God's not a being. God is the active being. God's essence is exactly existence. That's what God is. God is not something that exists. God is the act, is act of existence. So that's a very important distinction to make, and that distinction becomes clear in the essence existence argument from Aquinas. It's also, and if you notice that during the whole arguments, I never mentioned time, we never mentioned about the history of the world, because it never comes into argument. It really doesn't matter whether the world has a beginning, it doesn't have a beginning, if it's eternal, it really doesn't matter. And note that within this framework, we can allow for things to be eternal, yet not God. See? So we can have essences that exist, and that essence is something that they are eternal. If they exist forever. That's just who they are, So, because sometimes when you talk about these sort of things, necessary beings, people ask, okay, why can't like a fundamental particle be the necessary being? Because it might be there forever. Yes, that's true. And that's completely fine. Something can be here forever. We can have things that never go out of existence. But what we talked about was logical impossibility of going out of existence. See, and that can only happen if what something is existence. And that can only happen for God. For something that cannot be logically, is impossible for it to be different from what it is. So even if something is eternal, like an angel or fundamental particle, or the world itself, still it can have an essence different from its existence. It still can be a creation, and a creation ex nihilo is happening all the time. So so when I think about God, I usually think about in this essence existence distinction, because it's much cleaner and gets right to the point, that whenever you try to make a mistake of thinking God as this like super entity, immaterial, very exotic thing, that's false. That's not what God is. God is not a thing that exists. God is the active being. So God doesn't have any genus. God can't be defined by its genus because it doesn't have any genus. So everything that we can say is only through the effects and analogy. All right, so I guess that was a very good wrap, and I will try to go into other issues related to the concept of God, especially a good God, and the problem of evil, because that's a very, very interesting topic to discuss. All right, I hope you enjoyed it.